Well, it's another episode of Tom Kennedy Science, and I'm your host, Dr. Tom Kennedy. Yeah, I got the mustache back again today, and it's really, really hot outside. I, of course, live in the American West, and if you've noticed, there's kind of this massive heat wave out here, but it's pretty hot today. So what we're going to talk about, related to swamp coolers and water and drought, is how do plants acquire water? Because if they don't get water, they die. Or they begin to wilt like this poor plant on the right. Yeah, we were house sitting and we had to go out and water our friend's plants. And I forgot to water them for one day. And that is what happens. I'm not a big fan of raised flower beds if they're not done correctly. This one, all the water would leak out. So you'd water it and then would just run off onto the ground. And the plants didn't get as much water as they should. So they wilted like this very quickly. Yeah, that's a sad tomato. Isn't that an REM song? She's a sad tomato. I know REM, big mega group from the 80s. They were pretty cool. So today, it's about how plants acquire water. A very important thing. So there's a couple questions we need to answer. How does water enter the root? And then once water gets into the root, how does it move from the root to the leaves? And interestingly, here's what's really cool. Plants don't spend any energy moving water. So you can look at a 200-foot tall pine tree, and that pine tree is spending zero energy moving water from the roots 200 feet up in the air. So how does it do that? So to understand how water is moving through these plants and actually into the plants, we need to know about water potential. The structure of the roots, the structure of the xylem, and we're going to talk about the theories of water movement once it gets into the tree or the plant. So importantly, you need to know about osmosis. Osmosis is a special case of diffusion for water. And of course, water flows from areas of high potential to low potential. Now, if you have low water potential, you have more solutes in it. So the more solutes you add to water, the lower the water potential. So think about this. If I start adding sugar, like sucrose or glucose or high fructose corn syrup, or if I'm adding salt to water, that is lowering the water potential. Our molecules, like sugar, they form hydrogen bonds with water and kind of lock it in. And the electrolytes, like our salts, sodium, chlorine, potassium, calcium. These electrolytes, they're actually ions, well, they're charged, so they hold on to water molecules and keep them from moving around. So it lowers water potential. So water with the highest potential is basically pure water. Now that's important. Water flows from high potential to low potential. And if water is going to flow into a root from the soil, that means one thing. The water potential inside the root has to be lower than the water potential in the soil. Remember, high to low. So water potential in the soil will always be higher than in the roots. If not, your roots dry out, your plant dries out, and you have a very sad, wilty plant. Or eventually it'll even die. I know plants don't really get sad. They don't have feelings. I know, it's sad. Plants don't have feelings, but they do respond to the environment. They just don't have a nervous system to interpret the signals like that. But they do absolutely respond to the environment. And they do wilt if they get too dry. So water enters in through the root. And it's crossing the epidermis. And it's doing that by osmosis. It gets into the cortex of the root. Now the cortex is the ground tissue. Right? And it's mostly a lot of carbohydrates. And it has to make its way through the cortex into the vascular bundle where you have the xylem and the phloem. And of course, your vascular tissue made up of xylem and phloem. Phloem carries your metabolites. Metabolism, chemical reactions. Those are chemicals that the plant is making. And the xylem carries water and minerals that is extracted from the soil. So how does water get into the xylem? There's a few routes that it can do, and it has to go through a couple steps here. So we need to know about the structure of the root. Okay, you got the epidermis, single layer of cells surrounding the root. And it's also got root hairs to increase surface area, increase the amount of water you can absorb. You have the cortex. That's the area between your epidermis and your vascular tissue. And this is ground tissue. It's made up of a lot of carbohydrates. And then you have the endodermis. This is the boundary between the cortex and the vascular tissue. And the endodermis is incredibly important for controlling ions that enter into this plant. Because just like us, you have to maintain a proper electrolyte balance. Plants like calcium and potassium. You have to keep the sodium out, right? Just like our cells. The pericycle, this is the outer part of the vascular tissue. Now what's important? Because it can actually form new roots. So you've got roots and then you've got another root flowing off of it. The reason why it comes off the pericycle is because if you're creating more roots, the vascular tissue has to be connected. So the way you connect that is from the cells forming the outer edge of your vascular tissue. That way, when you have roots branching, their vascular tissue will be connected. And then, of course, the vascular tissue is your xylem and your phloem. And you can easily see the xylem cells because they're much larger than the phloem cells. And your xylem is also dead at maturity, whereas your phloem is not. So the xylem, you notice where it is? It's at the center part of the root, okay? And so water's got to cross both the endodermis and the pericycle. And it's going to control, the endodermis is going to control the electrolytes, the ions that get into the vascular system. So there are 3 routes the water can take through the cortex. You can do the apoplastic route, you can do the symplastic route, and then you can do the transmembrane route. Let's take a closer look at each one of these. Let's start with the apoplastic route. Apo kind of means away. The apoplastic route, if you notice, does not go through the cells. It does not cross a cellular membrane, at least right up until the endodermis. So this is outside your membranes, but it does go through the cell walls. You know, cell walls are made up of cellulose, carbohydrate, they're hydrophilic, water can flow through them. There's also spaces inside of plants. And you can also have an apoplastic route in a leaf as well. So it's going to be between these cell walls and spaces between the cells. However, at some point, right before the water or gets into the vascular system, it must pass through the endodermis. And what that means now is even though the water is rapidly moving through this apoplastic route, so water is going to enter into the endodermis and it's going to be blocked to control ions. And we'll talk more about that in a few seconds. But just to make sure we're clear here, the apoplast, everything external to the membrane. And that's your cell wall, that's your cellular spaces. And the reason why you have this apoplastic route, you're not traveling through membranes. You can move water more quickly through the cortex going through the apoplastic route. Now, as I said earlier, once you hit the endodermis, the water has to flow into the endodermis. So do the minerals. And the reason why is because it's going to control the electrolytes that enter into the vascular tissue. And by doing so, you can also affect things like osmotic pressure. Okay, this is kind of cool. So part of the way it does this is there's a waxy coating around the endodermis called the Casparian strip. The Casparian strip is made of these specialized cells that are full of wax. Wax is a lipid, right? It's hydrophobic. Water can't cross through it. So then you're blocked by the Casparian strip. And then now the endodermis, through all these different types of ion channels, facilitated transport, and even active transport, can now regulate the ions that enter into the vascular tissue. And like I said, that's very important for maintaining homeostasis for these plants. And whilst allowing potassium and calcium to enter, it'll block sodium because plants don't want a lot of sodium in there. And by regulating these ions, they can also create root pressure. They can let potassium and calcium in. And what happens is you're lowering the water potential inside the xylem. Water keeps flowing into the xylem and it'll actually push it up. It creates root pressure. Now the other route is the symplastic route. This is traveling through the membranes. Now remember, all your plant cells have a cell wall surrounding them, but adjacent plant cells are connected by a structure called the plasmodesmata. And the plasmodesmata actually has a cell membrane, connecting the two cells. So you create this little channel between the two cells, and this allows water and minerals to pass through. It also allows the complete exchange of the cytoplasm. You can also exchange chemical signals in addition as well. And the symplastic route just isn't quite as fast. And then lastly, you can go through the transmembrane route. Now the transmembrane route is traveling through the cells and through the membranes. And a membrane is still water soluble only in the fact and water molecules are very small, so they can slip through these hydrophobic interiors of the membrane. So even though they're made up of phospholipids, because water is small, it'll go through it, but it can be slowed down. To speed up the rate at which water can flow through these membranes, there's a protein called an aquaporin. Aqua, water, porin, porous. So aquaporins, what they do is they help with facilitated diffusion, right? Because remember, you can't really pump water. Well, there are some water vacuoles that can contract and force water out. But when it comes to the molecular machinery of cells, there's no water pump. But you do have an aquaporin that can facilitate the diffusion of water into and out of cells. So they can increase the rate of movement. And interestingly, aquaporins have only been discovered in the last 20 or 30 years. They're really common inside of our kidneys, for example, and plants use them as well. Now, we got the water in the roots, into the xylem. What happens next? We kind of got a little bit of a hint with the controlling of the electrolytes in the xylem, creating root pressure. Here's some important points. Water moves passively. Plants aren't spending energy to move water through them. So they control the movement of water by controlling water potential. And when we talk about animal form and function, guess what? They do the same thing. So we've got facilitated transport and active transport that the plant will use these things together to regulate water potential, lowering it, increasing it to move water. Because we're not moving water directly, we're affecting its movement by changing water potential. Now, how else can plants move water? Well, as we go from the roots up to the leaves, there are several different theories to explain this. And it may not be that just one of these is correct. It could be that one is mostly correct under some circumstances. The other one is most correct under other circumstances. And there's a combination of all three of these. So they're not mutually exclusive, and they may be working together. These include root pressure. Now remember, root pressure, that's pressure potential from the roots. That's where that Casparian strip endodermis comes into play, right? Regulating those ions. Capillary action. You ever notice that water, if you take two objects, it kind of like will go up a really small tube? That's capillary action. And then cohesion tension. You ever sucked on a straw? You pull the water up through the straw. That's because you're creating negative pressure in your mouth, and atmospheric pressure is pushing down on the water, and it goes up the straw and into your mouth. And this is actually a force generated by leaves as water exits the leaves through a process called transpiration. So let's take a look at root pressure. Your endodermis, let's say it starts adding a few more potassium ions, calcium ions into the xylem. That's lowering water potential. So water will move into the xylem. And as it moves into the xylem, there's more water there, right? It creates pressure and it pushes water up the xylem. And it can do this for a foot or so, maybe a couple feet. And in fact, small plants at night, they may actually start forcing water out of their leaves because the root pressure comes so high. And this is called guttation. And this is when plants are losing water even though the stomata are closed. Remember, the stomata are these little openings on the underside of a plant surrounded by two guard cells. And at night, the guard cells close for the most part. And water, if the water pressure gets so high, it'll actually force water out of those guard cells. And like this leaf here, it's showing little guttation, water being pushed out. The second theory, this is capillary action. Water can travel up a narrow tube. So xylem is a narrow tube. And we've got this effect of adhesion and cohesion. Remember, water is cohesive. Hydrogen bonds. All the water molecules stick together. Adhesion. Well, water sticks to other things that are also hydrophilic. Well, the inside of your xylem cells, well, we got cell walls, right? Cell walls made of cellulose. That's, sugar. It's hydrophilic. So basically, the water molecules will stick to themselves. They'll stick to the cell walls of these plants. And there's also some surface tension up at the top. And that forms a meniscus. And that helps to pull the water column up, especially as you got this air interface there. So the cohesion tension theory kind of is an extension of the capillary action. And the idea here is that you've got these tiny tubes. The water is attracted to itself, cohesion, to the cell wall of the xylem, adhesion. And what happens is water evaporates from the leaf. There's a meniscus. And as it evaporates, other water molecules move up to take their place, and it pulls water up from the roots. So the cohesion tension theory is relying on capillary action. And it works so well that you can have 300 feet sequoia trees in California. It's amazing. Those trees, or even a little tree that's only this big, little baby, they rely on this cohesion tension theory to pull water up, and they spend no energy doing it. How cool is that? So water gets pulled a long ways, and we call this transpirational pull. So you look at the leaf structure, which is you've got your cuticle, which is this waxy covering over the epidermis. And that's your top layer of your cells. Below that, you have what is called your mesophyll cells. These are, of course, parenchyma cells. Parenchyma. Remember, they're part of the ground tissue. And what they do is they have all the chloroplasts. So this is where your photosynthesis is taking place. The inside of the mesophyll is a little spongy. There's a lot of air spaces in there. And as water molecules get in there, they'll leave through the stomata, which is transpiration. It's technically evapotranspiration. And as the water molecules are evaporating away, there's a tiny little meniscus, air to water surface interaction there. And as it evaporates, like I said, it keeps pulling the water up. So that's pretty cool. So let's do a little recap. Water enters the root through osmosis and then passes through the cortex, part of the ground tissue. Okay. Then it crosses through the Casparian strip, through the endodermis cells. Okay. So it's either going the apoplastic, symplastic, or transmembrane pathway. But no matter what, it has to go through the endodermis to get past the Casparian strip and to the xylem. And then we've got this cohesion tension theory where the water is being evaporated from the leaves, which is pulling the water up the xylem cells. Okay? And then it finally leaves through the stomata. So that's how it works. And there's a few important things we need to know. Remember, water is constantly moving from high potential to low potential. That means that for water to enter the root must have lower water potential than the soil. And then for the water to exit the leaves, the atmosphere has to have lower potential than the leaves. So there's this constant lowering of water potential as water goes from the roots to the shoots and then out the leaves. And in fact, the outside air pressure can be really, really low, like minus 100 megapascals. So water is always trying to exit the leaves. Well, that's our brief introduction to how water moves through plants. Now stay tuned for another lecture I'm going to do. You can guess the next one. How do plants transport sugars through the phloem? So that will be the subject of the next lecture. All right, I'll see you next time.